qui embrouille évidemment souvent les débats, c'est le sens que chacun donne aux mots. Prenons le mot socialisme. Que peut bien signifier un mot utilisé par Staline, par Hitler et par Martine Aubry? Chomsky revient à la source en rappelant ce que fut l'objectif du socialisme à la fin du XIXe siècle. Pour lui, le socialisme suppose au minimum le contrôle démocratique de la production et des autres aspects de la vie.
Ralph Nader dit le capitalisme n'échouera jamais parce que le socialisme viendra toujours à son secours.
Neither of these words, capitalism or socialism, mean anything. What we call capitalism in the West, what we call capitalist, is just private ownership, private control with massive public support and initiative. So the innovation, the development, and so on, anything that's costly and risky is handed over to the public. What's profitable is handed over to the private sector. That's what we call capitalism. What we call socialism is an outgrowth of the most anti-socialist movement in modern history, namely Bolshevism. I mean, as soon as Lenin and Trotsky took over, the first things they did was destroy every socialist institution that had developed, Soviets, workers' councils, every democratic institution, and they turned the population into what they called a labor army, acting at the rule of the maximal leader. That's exactly the opposite of socialism. Socialism meant workers' control over production. This was the biggest blow against socialism that had yet happened.
Vous tenez ces propos dans le documentaire qu'on présente en France. Et à chaque fois, le public dit « Mais qu'est-ce que c'est Non, on va quand même pas attaquer Lénine et Trotsky. Qu'est-ce qu'ils racontent ?» Mais non, est-ce que vous pouvez développer un peu cette opposition entre l'anarcho-socialisme ou l'anarcho-syndicalisme d'un côté et ce qu'on appelle le socialisme autoritaire de l'autre? Enfin, c'est deux notions.
Well, if you want to call it socialism and you want to call this system capitalism, okay, but it's worth remembering that those terms have nothing to do with their meaning. I mean, the core notion of socialism, before it was distorted by the Bolsheviks, was workers controlled by producers over production. I mean, the Soviet system was the opposite of that. You had more of that in the West than you had in Russia. Now, Lenin and Trotsky had a principled reason for destroying socialism in Russia. I mean, they were orthodox Marxists in a sense that Marx was not. But there was a version of orthodox Marxism which said that an impoverished, backward, mostly agricultural country like Russia couldn't go on to socialism. You first had to drive it by force through industrialization. And then after that, by the iron laws of history and so on, somehow socialism would come. That's not Marx's view, but that was their interpretation of Marx. So therefore we have to destroy the early elements of socialism, like the Soviets and the workers' councils, and simply drive this impoverished peasant society to industrialization, and then, someday, in the millennium, socialism will come. So an interesting question is why this total opposition to socialism is called socialism, and there are good reasons for it. I mean, in the 20th century, you had two major propaganda systems. One was the Western one was the Eastern one. The Western one far more powerful, but at least there were two. They disagreed about a lot of things, but they agreed on calling this system socialism. The West did it in order to denigrate socialism. The East did it to try to gain the moral appeal of socialism for the anti-socialist activities that they were carried out. Now, when the world's two propaganda systems agree on something, it's pretty hard for people to extricate themselves from it. It's partially existed. For example, elements of it existed in Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution. If you read Lenin's works, between April and October, he was taking a kind of an anarchist position. You read State and Revolution, It's like a real socialism, kind of anarchist view of the world. As soon as before that and after that, he was just an authoritarian. And a cynical, but I suspect accurate interpretation of that is that he was a good politician. And he knew that there were real socialist currents in Russia, and he wanted to appeal to them to get support. So he adopted their views, though he didn't accept them. And you could see that as soon as he took power.
Catalogué anarchiste-socialiste, Chomsky se méfie des étiquettes. Pour lui, dans une société anarchiste, le contrôle de la production doit être collectif, mais de façon décentralisée. Et ce n'est pas le désordre, c'est la fameuse formule, l'ordre moins le pouvoir.
On vous classe dans les anarchistes socialistes, anarcho-socialistes, anarcho-syndicalistes. On sait très bien que vous n'aimez pas du tout être enfermé dans des boîtes et des étiquettes. Mais quel sens ces mots-là ont aujourd'hui pour vous?
It's what's called in French socialisme libertaire.
C'est ce mot-là. C'est ce qu'on appelle en France.
It's socialism.
Libertaire.
Anarchism is just the libertarian form of socialism. It's real socialism, which says, yes, workers should control production, communities should control the communities, there shouldn't be owners, and there shouldn't be a powerful state ordering people what to do. I mean, that's authentic socialism. Whenever it has developed, it's been crushed by force. I mean, the most striking example was Spain in 1936. There you had a real socialist revolution for about a year. And it was crushed by the joint efforts of the communists, the fascists, and the West. They disagreed on other things, but they agreed that this has to be crushed.
Est-ce que c'est pas justement ça le problème auquel se sont heurtés Lénine et Trotsky? Est-ce que c'est pas ça le problème? C'est qu'à chaque fois, ces mouvements anarcho-syndicalistes se heurtent à la réaction qui est forcément violente. Donc qu'est-ce qu'on fait à ce moment-là? Est-ce que Lénine avait d'autre choix que d'instituer un État fort face à la réaction?
If his goal was to crush socialism and to drive Russia by force, this peasant society, drive it by force into industrialization as a labor army at his command, yeah, he had to use violence. Now, it's kind of interesting that Marx had a different view. Marx, especially in the last several decades of his life, was very intrigued by the discoveries of the Narodniks about Russian peasant society. And he found sources of revolutionary activity there and thought they ought to be cultivated.
Le mouvement narodniki, à la fin du XIXe siècle, en Russie, fut un genre de socialisme agraire, bâti sur des unités économiques autonomes de plusieurs villages, reliés entre eux en une sorte de fédération qui remplacerait l'État.
The urban Marxists, like Lenin, thought it ought to be crushed. Later work of Marx has more or less been suppressed because the forces of Marxism that survived didn't like it, you know.
Bonsoir à tous. D'abord, ça marche là?
Ce qui ressort souvent des débats, c'est notre ignorance de notre propre histoire sociale. Dans la très élégante ville de Boston, on ignore tout de ce qui s'est passé dans une ville toute proche, Lawrence, avec ses immenses usines de textiles. Au début du XXe siècle, des milliers d'ouvriers immigrés venus de toute l'Europe, et en majorité des femmes et des enfants, travaillaient là. Or, en 1912, a éclaté une grève immense, héroïque et victorieuse, et qui est restée dans les mémoires grâce à une chanson reprise en chœur lors des immenses manifs, Bread and Roses. Bread and Roses, tout, du pain, mais aussi des roses.
History is written by the powerful. You know? In fact, if you look back at the United States has a very violent labor history, much more so than Europe. Hundreds of American workers were being killed when nobody was being killed in Europe. You know. And when there were developments of socialism and democracy, they were crushed by force. If you go back to this region where we are now, the origins of the Industrial Revolution, there is a rich literature from the mid-19th century of by working people working in the textile mills, and, you know, artisans and others. They had their own newspapers, they were running them, they were eloquent, and they had very interesting material.